Ancient Egypt is famous for its pyramids and temples, but the culture was responsible for a raft of other inventions and developments, some more noble than others. On this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. We all love to talk about the wonders of ancient Egypt. The pyramids, the royal tombs, the Mask of King Tut, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. But the Egyptians developed a lot more than that in their 3,000-year history. Today, we are going to discuss 12 lesser-known and maybe some not-so-glorious innovations that came out of ancient Egypt. Number 1. Hydrology. Okay, hydrology is the practice of diverting a river to make land arable. So essentially, you're channeling the water through the land through little canals. And the Egyptians did this practice really early on. We find evidence of this going into the Nagata III period, where we see kings using a hoe to open up new channels for the water to flow inland. The Egyptians were masters of hydrology. They were even able to get the Nile River to come close to the pyramids, where they could just float stones right up to the temple. So they were able to manipulate the river in such a way as to move cargo and to irrigate land that was in other ways just not fertile. So that's their first incredible innovation, which was the hydrology. Number 2, land reclamation. Long before the Dutch reclaimed the land of the Netherlands from the ocean, the ancient Egyptians took the Fayum, drained the water, and ran a channel called the Merware into the Fayum to supply that land with constant water, and they basically turned that hunting zone into basically an agricultural paradise. And even today, it's still used for agricultural purposes. But before then, it was just a massive lake. And it was Senwosret II that converted that massive lake into farming land. So as far as we can tell, this was the first instance of land reclamation that we find in historical sources. Number 3, beef jerky and other salted meats. Okay, we all know that the Egyptians did mummification. Basically, you take a dead body, you clean it out, and you basically pack it with natron so the body becomes salted and resistant to decay. The Egyptians also discovered that they could do this with food, particularly beef and fish. And what they would do is they would take strips of beef or shanks of beef and cleaned fish, and they'd pack it in natron. And they'd essentially mummify beef and fish for later consumption. Now, the way they would actually eat this is not so much like we would eat it today, but more like how, say, the homesteaders in the United States would use it, which is they would soak it in water, get rid of the salt, and then use it to cook with. So it's very, very interesting that they found this method of preserving meat. Now, is it possible that other cultures developed this too? Yeah, it's possible. But what made it so doable in Egypt was they had a lot of natron. Natron was a very, very common commodity in Egypt. So they could mine this natron and bring it back for food preservation and for mummification. So, as far as we can tell, the Egyptians invented beef jerky. Number 4, columned halls. Now, halls themselves are not unique to ancient Egypt. But The columned hall happens very, very early in ancient Egypt, as early as Dynasty 3, and perhaps even earlier. The earliest columned hall we have is the one of the mortuary temple of King Zoser at Saqqara. Now, the thing is that column halls did not remain in Egypt. They spread out all over the Mediterranean. The Greeks, when they designed their temples, they looked at, say, the Egyptian temples that had been built that way for thousands of years prior and copied those design templates into their own temples. And the Romans did the same thing. So all those columned temples that we find all over the Mediterranean owe their start to the Egyptian invention of the columned hall. Number 5, clocks. Okay, now this is not your kind of clock that's a watch. This is the invention of the water clock. And the oldest water clock dates to Amenhotep III and was found at Karnak Temple. Now, what is a water clock? It's essentially a bowl with a hole in the bottom where the water drips out of it slowly, and the water sinks over time in the level of the bowl. And looking at the bowl, you can figure out what time of day it is. Now, what's interesting about Egyptian water clocks is that they are divided for 12 hours of day, regardless of how long the actual day is. And some of these clocks had seasonal adjustments. So they adjusted it for the season of the year. So basically a winter season would have 12 shorter hours than, say, a season in the summer, which would have 12 longer hours. So this is a very, very interesting thing that the Egyptians divided time in that 12-hour cycle without the use of the circle or the compass or, say, the sundial. And they did it in such a way that they could calibrate this to their time and particular place. So it was a remarkable invention for the time. But the Egyptians are the first people that developed the clock. Number 6, artificial blue pigment. This is what's called Egyptian blue. And it's one of the earliest pigments that we find that is man-made. Now, what's really, really interesting about this is it sort of shoots in the foot this whole idea that ancient people couldn't see the color blue, which is complete nonsense. Every culture could see blue, okay? Even if they didn't have a word for it, they could still see it. And the Egyptians were no better. Egyptian blue was made by firing together sand, copper, and natron. And it was developed as early as the pre-dynastic period. Dynasty 0, Nagata 3 is the earliest of this artificial blue pigment that we find. And it's even used in a type of ceramic called faience, which is kind of a self-glazing ceramic. But the Egyptians were responsible for the development of this Egyptian blue, and it's found all over the Mediterranean because they exported it. There's even some beads that were found at Nuzi that contained Egyptian blue. So these were used as trade goods that the Egyptians exported everywhere. So it's a very interesting little invention that they don't get enough credit for, but it's really, really important in that this is an artificial pigment. It simulated something that was considered to be very precious. So in some respects, too, it's also one of the first simulated gemstones, because one of the things that Egyptian blue simulated was turquoise. So in places where turquoise wasn't common or expensive, and even in Egypt, Egyptian blue would be used as a substitute. Bench number 7, glass. Okay. In the New Kingdom period, they were still continuing to make Egyptian blue. The formula for Egyptian blue was sand, copper, and natron. But let's say you take out some of the natron, a little bit of the natron, and you added instead ash, hot ash. What you then get out of that is glass. You fire that all up, and you get glass. And the earliest glass that's discovered was in the palace of Amenhotep III in Thebes. And they have various little pieces of glass that have been recovered from that palace. So there was glass being made nearby to that palace and used as, say, for example, plugs for pierced earrings. They used it for small vessels. They did a variety of things, and they even mixed it with various colors, so they had been able to already do some artwork with this. So it's an incredible discovery that ends up being shipped out all over the place again, but it has its origins in New Kingdom Egypt. Number 8, mixed media artwork. Okay, now, what is mixed media artwork? It's essentially art where you take two different medias and you combine them together. We hear this term sometimes thrown about as being polychromism, where, for example, the statues in Greece were originally all colored. Well, that idea didn't originate with the Greeks. The Egyptians had been doing that long before the Greeks ever got a temple erected. In fact, you go to Egypt today and you can still see much of the color preserved on various reliefs and statues in ancient Egypt. For example, if you go to Medina Habu, you can see much of the original painting on the walls. So first of all, they would carve out the glyphs in the rock and the statues, and then they would paint over top of it. One of the things we have to understand is in ancient Egypt, everything was painted. It was a garish cacophony of color. And it was everywhere. Egyptians loved color. And this is not surprising, because the desert is a very colorless place. I was talking to somebody who has spent a bunch of time out in the Egyptian desert, and he's told me that one of the things that happens when you're out that far is all you see is yellow. Everything is yellow. And you become, in a sense, color-starved. You want to see lots and lots of color. This is particularly true of, say, desert environments, where the people who live in desert environments prize bright colors. And that's because of that color starvation. So, when it comes to Egyptian temples, statues, jewelry, funerary work, it's not surprising that they would adapt quickly to a mixed media art framework, because they'd want that color in their statues, in their temples, everywhere. We even see this going all the way back to the Old Kingdom. So this is very, very old in ancient Egypt. Even the statue of Ramosa has this sort of mixed media, on the statue, where they've done the statue in one stone, they did the eyes in another stone, and then they painted it all in plaster in various colors. And they're spectacular. It's one of the great masterpieces of Egypt. Okay, number 9. Papyrus and scrolls. Now, we don't use scrolls as much today, but Egyptians did invent papyrus, which was one of the original writing media. It could be rolled and transported easily. And when it came to, say, the cultures of the Levant, they adapted the scroll from what the Egyptians used. So while the Egyptians used, say, papyrus and created scrolls out of that, Levantines would then take, say, parchment and make their own scrolls. But the origin of the scroll is definitely from Egypt, because they were the producers of papyrus. It made for a convenient way to transport writing. Number 10. Pornography. Okay. This is one of the less noble aspects of ancient Egypt. But they did invent this. Okay? The Egyptians did have some lewd drawings written on papyrus and scrolls for the purpose of self-gratification. Okay? A few of these have survived. So, it's not... The less said here, the better, but they were responsible for the invention of pornography. At least as far as we can tell. Number 11. Birth control. Now, the Egyptians, especially among the lower classes, did see a need for birth control. We do have things in the medical texts, such as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, where it talks about various types of birth control. The most common one that's often discussed is, say, crocodile dung, which was used for birth control. Was this effective? Who knows? I don't think anyone's going to try it. We also find in some tombs a sheepskin that was sewn into what could be called a contraceptive. So we do have instances in ancient Egypt of various birth control methods. And the 12th one we're going to talk about today is economic inflation. Now, they didn't set out to do this intentionally, but it was a development that did come out of Egypt. They had a 3,000-year-old economy, and prices did rise steadily over time. Now, the Egyptians did not have a fiat currency. It was a barter economy. But even barter economies are subject to the forces of inflation. The higher the demand on a good, the more valuable it becomes. And the more you have to trade in other things and forms to obtain that product. We saw this, for example, especially during, say, the time of Ramses III, towards the end of his reign, where economic inflation skyrocketed out of control. Now, some of the ways that the Egyptians tried to mitigate economic inflation, and they were aware of this. They were aware when things got more expensive, and they did take measures to counteract the inflation. So they were aware of monetary policy in their time. This is not a new concept to them. But the way they tended to do it is one of the few ways you could do it in a barter economy, which was to increase the supply of goods. This is one of the reasons why Egypt had a hegemony. Basically, satellite countries that they could extort for tribute. So you basically take goods and services out of those neighboring countries, you bring them into Egypt, you increase the supply of certain things to counteract inflation. And things that would counteract inflation in ancient Egypt included grainstuffs. For example, barley. That could be brought in and used to offset the cost of wheat. They would basically take the land that would be used for barley, start producing more wheat, and then taking the barley that they imported and then use that to make the beer for water purification. Precious metals is another example. A lot of goods in ancient Egypt were pegged to the bronze deben, which is a weight of bronze. You add more bronze into the economy, you increase the supply of bronze, which decreases the cost of, say, grain, which is pegged according to the cost of the deben. So the Egyptians were very, very aware of the power of inflation, especially at times when it was running rampant. And these were normally at times when the Egyptian economy was not doing so well. So, anyway, that's 12 innovations and developments that came out of Egypt that are not often talked about, but should be mentioned anyway, because in some ways we owe it to them. Not all of them are noble, not all of them are good, okay? But they did happen. So, anyway, we hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.